Some mistakes you carry for the rest of your life. For Elna Dreer, that mistake cost her the only family she had left. 15 years ago, her brother walked into Montana's Bitterroot Mountains and never came back. Now she lives alone in a cabin on the ridge, with nothing but her dog, her rifle, and the weight of what she lost. One frozen evening, an elderly couple appears at her door. They're underdressed, shivering, and desperate for shelter. They say they're just passing through, but something feels wrong. They look at her cabin, like they've seen it before. They speak like they know her. And as the night grows colder and the fire burns low, Elna starts to wonder, who are these strangers, and what do they know about her brother? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning always began the same way. Elna Dreer woke before dawn, when the mountain air still held the sharp bite of night, and frost clung to the cabin windows in delicate patterns. She didn't need an alarm. Her body knew the rhythm of this life, had memorized it through 15 winters of repetition. She would lie there for a moment, listening to the silence that surrounded her like a blanket. Before the day demanded her attention, Timber stirred first, the big German shepherd, lifting his graying muzzle from his paws and watching her with those intelligent brown eyes. He was 8 years old now, had been with her since he was a pup, and understood her routines better than most people ever had. When she sat up and swung her legs over the side of the bed, he rose too, stretching in that long, deliberate way dogs do, ready for whatever the day would bring. The cabin was cold. It was always cold in the mornings, even with the embers still glowing in the wood stove. Elna pulled on her wool socks, then her boots, then the flannel shirt she'd left draped over the chair. Everything had its place here. Everything had its purpose. There was no room for disorder when you lived alone on a mountain ridge 20 miles from the nearest town. She fed Timber first, pouring kibble into his bowl and refreshing his water. Then she stoked the fire, adding split logs until the flames caught and spread. The ritual was soothing in its predictability. While the cabin warmed, she made coffee in the old percolator, the kind her father had used when he was alive. The sound of it bubbling on the stove was one of the few noises that brought her comfort. Outside, the world was still painted in shades of blue and gray, the sun not yet cresting the eastern peaks. Elna stepped onto the porch with her coffee, rifle slung over her shoulder out of habit, and surveyed her domain. The Bitterroot Range stretched in every direction, ridge after ridge of pine and granite disappearing into the distance. In summer, this view took your breath away. In winter, it could take your life if you weren't careful. She knew these mountains the way some people knew city streets. Every trail, every hollow, every place where the wind cut through with particular force. Her grandfather had built this cabin in 1947, back when men still believed they could carve out a piece of wilderness and call it their own. Her father had maintained it, improved it, taught her and her brother Owen how to survive up here. How to read weather in the clouds, how to track deer through snow, how to respect the mountain because it would never respect you back, Owen. The thought of him was like touching a bruise that never quite healed. 15 years since he'd walked into these mountains and disappeared. 15 years since the search parties had combed every trail, every ravine, every possible place a man could fall or lose his way. They'd found nothing. No body, no sign, no closure. Just an absence that grew heavier with each passing year. Elna finished her coffee and went back inside. Timber was waiting by the door, eager for their morning patrol. She pulled on her heavy coat, checked that her rifle was loaded, and grabbed the worn map she kept by the door. The map was covered in pencil marks, annotations in her neat handwriting. Each X marked a place she'd searched. Each circle indicated where Owen had been known to hike, and one red dot, darker than the others, showed the last place anyone had seen him alive. They set out as the sun began to break over the peaks, turning the snow golden. The patrol route varied slightly each day, but the purpose remained the same. She checked for signs of trespassers, looked for downed trees that might block trails, kept an eye on the weather patterns forming in the west. And she searched, always searching, even though she knew after 15 years the chances of finding anything were nearly zero. The search parties had given up after 3 months. The official explanation was exposure or a fall, the mountains claiming another victim. But Elna had never accepted it. Owen was too experienced, too careful. He'd grown up on these trails just like she had. He wouldn't have made the kind of mistake that got you killed. They'd been close, she and Owen, just the two of them after their parents died in a car accident 10 years before Owen's disappearance. He was 5 years younger, and she'd always felt responsible for him, even when he'd grown into a man who stood 6 feet tall and could carry a full pack for miles without complaint. He'd been the optimistic one, the one who saw the best in people. She'd been the cautious one, the one who kept them safe. That last day played in her mind constantly, a film reel that never stopped running. They'd planned a day hike together, nothing ambitious, just a loop trail they'd walked dozens of times. But at the last minute, Owen had said he wanted to take a different route, explore a side trail he'd heard about. She'd said no, that she didn't know that area well enough. He'd laughed, told her she worried too much, and promised he'd be careful she'd let him go. That was the mistake. She'd stood in this very cabin and watched him head out alone, backpack on his shoulders, that easy grin on his face. He'd waved at the tree line, and then he was gone. When he didn't come back by nightfall, she'd gone looking. When she couldn't find him in the dark, she'd called for help. The sheriff's department, the volunteer search and rescue teams, even a helicopter when the weather allowed. They'd searched for weeks, then months. His face had been on missing person posters throughout Montana. Tips had come in, each one a knife of hope that inevitably led nowhere. Eventually everyone moved on. Life continued for other people. But Elna stayed here in the cabin, maintaining her vigil. She quit her job as a park ranger, sold her truck, cut ties with friends who tried to comfort her. She didn't want comfort. She wanted answers. And she was convinced that if she stayed close to the place where Owen had vanished, if she walked these trails often enough, she would find them. The isolation suited her. People had tried to help at first. Sheriff Ben Holloway still stopped by a few times a year, always with the same concerned expression, always asking if she was all right. Her old friend Pauline Travers had called regularly for the first 5 years, leaving messages on the satellite phone, inviting her to come stay in town. But Elna had pushed them all away. She couldn't explain that being around people who'd given up on Owen felt like a betrayal. The morning patrol took 3 hours. Elna and Timber covered 5 miles of terrain, checking a series of landmarks she'd established over the years. An old hunter's blind, a spring that never froze, a rock formation that looked like a bear if you squinted. Everything was as it should be. No fresh tracks except those of deer and elk. No signs of human presence except her own. Back at the cabin, she went through her afternoon routine. Chopped firewood to replenish what she'd burned. Checked her supplies, canned goods, dried beans, flour, coffee. She made the 2-hour drive to Ridgemont for provisions once a month, no more. The rest of the time, she lived off what she'd stored and what the mountain provided. In summer, there were berries and wild greens. In fall, she sometimes shot a deer. In winter, she made do with less. She spent the afternoon cleaning her rifle and oiling her boots, small tasks that kept her hands busy. Timber dozed by the fire, his paws twitching as he dreamed of chasing something through the snow. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. She noted it without concern. Wind was common up here, especially in late autumn. As the light began to fade, she stood at the window and looked out at the gathering dusk. The temperature was dropping fast. She could feel it even through the cabin walls. This time of year, night fell early and cold. The kind of cold that could kill if you weren't prepared for it. She'd seen it happen. Hikers who underestimated the mountain, who thought a sunny afternoon meant they were safe. They'd find them in spring sometimes when the snow melted. She made a simple dinner, venison stew from the pot she kept simmering on the stove, adding to it each day. Ate it with bread she'd baked 2 days ago, cleaned her bowl and put it away, fed Timber his evening meal. The routines stacked on top of each other, building the scaffolding of a life that looked, from the outside, like loneliness. But Elna didn't think of it that way. This was her penance and her purpose. This was how she stayed close to Owen. In the evening she sat in her father's old rocking chair and tried to read, but her attention kept drifting to the window. The wind was really howling now, and snow had started to fall. Not unusual for November, but something felt different about this storm. Heavier, more insistent. Timber felt it too. He'd stopped dozing and was sitting up, ears alert, looking at the door. Elna set down her book. She trusted the dog's instincts. If something was wrong, he'd know before she did. She stood and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. The snow was coming down in sheets now, already accumulating on the porch rail. She could barely see 10 feet beyond the cabin. That was when Timber growled. Not his alert bark, but a low, uncertain sound deep in his chest. Elna's hand moved instinctively to the rifle she kept by the door. Living alone this far from civilization taught you to be ready for anything. Bears, though they should be denning by now. Mountain lions. Or worse, the occasional desperate criminal who thought a remote cabin meant easy pickings. Then she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the wind or the storm. A voice calling out. She couldn't make out the words, but it was human. Someone was out there. Elna grabbed her rifle and a flashlight. She opened the door a crack, and the wind immediately tried to tear it from her hands. Snow swirled into the cabin, melting on the warm floorboards. She shone the flashlight into the darkness and saw movement. 2 figures bent against the wind, stumbling toward the cabin. They were older, that much was clear even at a distance. A man supporting a woman, both of them woefully underdressed for the storm. The man wore just a light jacket, the woman a cardigan. No hats, no gloves. They looked like they'd walked out of a church service and gotten lost on the way home. The man saw her light and called out again. This time she heard the words clearly. "Please, can we rest here tonight?" Every instinct Elna had developed over 15 years of solitude screamed at her to say no, to close the door and let them find shelter somewhere else. She didn't know these people. She didn't want these people here. This cabin was her sanctuary, her connection to Owen. Strangers would pollute it with their presence and their needs. But even as she thought it, she knew she couldn't turn them away. Not in this storm. They'd be dead within an hour if they stayed out in this weather. And despite everything, despite the walls she'd built around herself, she wasn't the kind of person who could live with that on her conscience. Owen wouldn't have been able to either. He would have invited them in without hesitation, offered them food and warmth and his easy smile. Elna stepped back and opened the door wide. "Come in," she said. Quickly, before you let all the heat out, the couple stumbled through the door, bringing the storm with them. Snow covered their hair and shoulders, and they were both shivering violently. Timber backed away, still uncertain, watching them with that same low growl rumbling in his throat. Elna closed the door and turned to face her unexpected guests, already regretting her moment of compassion. But it was done now. They were inside, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Whatever happened next, she was committed to seeing it through. She just didn't know yet how much this decision would cost her, or what secrets were about to walk through her door, disguised as desperation. The man helped the woman to the chair nearest the wood stove, while Elna watched, rifle still in hand, but lowered. Up close, she could see they were in their late 60s or early 70s. The man had thin grey hair, plastered to his head by melting snow, deep lines around his eyes and mouth. The woman looked frailer, her lips tinged blue with cold, her hands trembling even after she pressed them close to the stove's warmth. "Thank you," the man said, his voice rough with cold and exhaustion. "God bless you. We didn't think we'd make it another mile." Elna said nothing. She set the rifle against the wall, close enough to reach if needed, and pulled blankets from the chest by her bed. She handed them to the couple without speaking, then moved to the stove to pour coffee from the pot that was always warm. Basic hospitality, the kind her father had taught her. You didn't let people freeze to death, even if you didn't trust them. The woman wrapped herself in the blanket and accepted the coffee with shaking hands. "Thank you so much. I'm Mavis Harrell. This is my husband, Grant." Grant nodded his thanks as he took his own cup. "We're so sorry to impose." Our car broke down about 5 miles back on the old forest road. We thought we could walk to town, but the storm came in so fast. Elna studied them both, her expression neutral, but her mind working. The old forest road. That road had been officially closed for 8 years, ever since the bridge washed out. There were signs posted, barriers across the entrance. You'd have to deliberately bypass them to get on that road. What were you doing on that road? She asked. Grant hesitated just a fraction too long before answering. GPS took us that way. We're not from around here. Didn't know it was closed. It was a reasonable explanation. Reasonable enough that most people would accept it without question. But Elna had spent 15 years alone with her thoughts, learning to notice the small details, the slight inconsistencies. And something about Grant's tone, the way his eyes slid away from hers when he spoke, set off alarms in her head. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Idaho," Mavis said quickly. "Near Boise. We're just passing through, heading to see our daughter in Missoula. Long way around to get to Missoula from Boise. We wanted to see the mountains," Grant said, warming his hands around the coffee cup. "Take the scenic route. We've got time being retired." The conversation felt wrong. Not obviously so, but wrong, in the way a note played slightly off-key would jar a trained musician. They were saying all the right words, but the melody underneath was dissonant. Elna noticed Grant's eyes moving around the cabin, taking in the details. The way his gaze lingered on the mantel where she kept family photos. The way he looked toward the hallway that led to the 2 bedrooms, as if he knew what was back there. The way his attention kept returning to the window that faced east, the one with the view of the ridgeline. "How did you know to come here?" Elna asked. "This cabin's not marked on any map. You can't see it from the road." "Saw the light," Grant said, "through the trees. We were desperate, so we headed toward it, possible. But this cabin sat in a hollow, sheltered by pines. You couldn't see its lights from the road unless you were looking at exactly the right angle." Mavis coughed, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of illness beyond just cold and exhaustion. Grant immediately turned his attention to her, rubbing her back, murmuring soft reassurances. Whatever else might be true about them, his concern for his wife seemed genuine. "She needs to get warm and rest," Elna said, making a decision. "You can stay the night. Storm should break by morning, then you'll need to leave." "Of course," Grant said gratefully. "We won't impose any longer than necessary." Elna showed them to Owen's room. She kept the door to that room closed most of the time, had barely set foot in it since he disappeared. But it had a bed, and heat from the stove reached it, and she wasn't about to give up her own room to strangers. She gave them extra blankets, pointed out the small bathroom down the hall, and left them to settle in. Back in the main room, she sat in her father's chair and tried to think through what was happening. Timber came to sit at her feet, still tense, still watching the closed bedroom door with suspicion. She trusted the dog's judgment. He didn't like these people, and neither did she, but beyond vague unease, she had nothing concrete. Maybe they were just lost travelers who'd made bad choices with their GPS. Maybe her isolation had made her paranoid, seeing threats in ordinary circumstances. She wanted to believe that, but she couldn't quite manage it. She dozed lightly in the chair, unwilling to go to her own bed while strangers occupied her home. Around midnight she heard movement. Grant emerged from the bedroom, moving quietly, clearly trying not to wake her. He saw she was awake and froze. "Just need the bathroom," he said. She nodded. Watched him walk down the hallway. Heard the bathroom door close. Waited. It took longer than it should have, too long. When he came back, she noticed his gaze lingering on the photos on the mantel again. "That your family?" he asked, gesturing to the frames. "Yes, they don't live here with you." "No." Grant seemed to want to ask more, but thought better of it when he saw her expression. He returned to the bedroom and closed the door. Elna stayed in her chair, wide awake now. Something was very wrong here. She just couldn't put her finger on what. The night stretched on. The storm continued to rage outside, wind howling around the cabin's corners. Elna sat with her rifle across her lap, watching and waiting. Around 3 in the morning, she heard voices from the bedroom. Mavis's voice, high and agitated. Grant's, low and soothing, trying to calm her. Then Mavis's voice rose loud enough for Elna to catch the words. "We should tell her. We have to tell her. It's been too long, Grant. Too long." Grant's response was muffled, but his tone was urgent, almost angry. Elna stood and moved closer to the door, pressing her ear against it. She caught fragments. Mavis saying something about the last time, and he was so kind, and we can't keep running. Grant telling her to rest, to save her strength, that they'd talk about it in the morning. Then silence. Elna backed away from the door and returned to her chair, her heart beating fast. The last time. They'd been here before. They knew this cabin. They were lying about being lost travelers. Dawn came slowly, the storm finally starting to break as grey light filtered through the windows. Elna had made a decision during the long night. When Grant and Mavis emerged from the bedroom, she was waiting for them with fresh coffee and a plate of bread and jam. But her rifle was on the table, unmistakable. "Sit down," she said. It wasn't an invitation, they sat. Grant's face had gone careful and neutral. Mavis looked fragile in the morning light, her skin pale, her eyes red-rimmed. "You've been here before," Elna said. It wasn't a question. Grant opened his mouth to deny it, but Mavis put her hand on his arm. "Don't," she said weakly. "I can't do this anymore. I'm dying anyway. I want to tell the truth." "Mavis," Grant's voice held warning. "No!" Mavis looked at Elna with tears in her eyes. "We knew your brother. We were the last ones to see Owen alive." The words hit Elna like a physical blow. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. 15 years of searching, 15 years of questions. And the answers had just walked through her door, asking for shelter. She stood up slowly, picked up the rifle, and pointed it directly at Grant's chest. Her voice when she spoke was steady, cold as the mountain winter outside. "Then you're going to tell me everything. And if I think you're lying, even once, I'll put a bullet in you and let the mountain have what's left. Do you understand?" Grant raised his hands slowly, his face going pale. "We understand. We'll tell you everything. That's why we came back." Outside, the storm was breaking. Inside Elna's cabin, 15 years of carefully maintained walls were about to come crashing down. Grant kept his hands raised, visible, non-threatening. Mavis sat with tears streaming down her face, making no move to wipe them away. Timber growled from his position by the stove, sensing the shift in the room's energy. Elna's finger rested on the trigger guard, her hands steady despite the chaos roaring through her mind. "Start talking," she said. "Now." Grant swallowed hard. "Can I lower my hands?" "I'm not going to do anything stupid. Keep them where I can see them," he nodded, resting his hands flat on the table. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been shame. 15 years ago, Mavis and I were living in Ridgemont. Not really living, barely surviving. I'd lost my job at the mill. We were behind on rent, couldn't afford food most days. We were desperate in a way that makes you do things you never thought you'd do. Elna said nothing, just kept the rifle trained on his chest. We met Owen at the diner in town. He saw us counting out change for coffee, and he bought us breakfast. Full breakfast, everything we could eat. Started talking to us, friendly-like. He was that kind of man, the kind who saw people hurting and wanted to help. Mavis made a small sound, something between a sob and a laugh. He was so kind. Too kind for this world. He bought us meals a few more times, Grant continued. Asked about our situation. We told him we were looking for work, that we'd take anything. He said he wished he could help more, that his family didn't have much, but they made do. He mentioned this cabin, mentioned that it had been in the family for generations. Elna felt ice forming in her chest. She knew where this was going, but she needed to hear it said. "Someone else overheard us talking to Owen," Grant said. "A man in the diner. He approached us later, said he had a proposition. Said the cabin Owen talked about was empty most of the time. Said the family kept valuables up here. Cash probably, jewelry, things we could take and sell and no one would know until days later. We'd be long gone by then. You planned to rob us." Elna's voice was flat, emotionless. "If she let the emotion in, she'd pull the trigger. We were starving," Mavis said weakly. "We'd been good people our whole lives. But hunger does something to you. Makes you into someone you don't recognize. So you followed him." Elna's grip on the rifle tightened. "You followed my brother into these mountains?" Grant nodded. "We watched the cabin for a few days. Saw that you and Owen went on hikes most afternoons. Figured we'd wait until you were both gone, get in and out quick. But that day Owen came back early. We were inside when he walked through the door. The image formed in Elna's mind with terrible clarity. Owen coming home to find his cabin ransacked, strangers rifling through his family's belongings. The betrayal he must have felt after showing them such kindness. What did you do to him? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. There was a confrontation, Grant said, his voice shaking now. Owen recognized us immediately. He wasn't angry at first, just confused. Asked us why, said he would have helped us if we'd asked. I think that made it worse, knowing we'd thrown his kindness back in his face. I asked what you did to him. Grant closed his eyes. I grabbed him, tried to stop him from going for the phone. We struggled. He hit his head on the door frame. Went down hard. Elna's world narrowed to a single point of rage. Her brother, hurt by people he'd tried to help. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. He was unconscious, Grant continued. We panicked. Didn't know how bad he was hurt, didn't know if he'd wake up. We were terrified. So we did something unforgivable. Tell me, Mavis spoke up, her voice breaking. We tied him up, used rope from your shed, tied his hands and feet. Thought he'd wake up eventually, free himself, and we'd be long gone by then. We took his watch, some money from a jar in the kitchen, not much. And we ran. Elna felt something breaking inside her chest. You left him tied up, injured, alone. We thought he'd be okay, Grant said desperately. I swear, we thought he'd wake up and get free. We checked for a pulse. He was alive? Where? Elna demanded. Where did you leave him? Not here, Mavis said. We'd heard him talk about an old hunting shelter 2 ridges north. We dragged him there. Thought if he woke up disoriented, he'd be able to get his bearings, find his way back. We didn't mean for him to die. You have to believe that. I don't have to believe anything. Elna's voice was ice over fire. You left my brother tied up in the wilderness with a head injury. What the hell did you think would happen? Grant had no answer for that. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of wind against the windows and Mavis's quiet weeping. Finally, Elna spoke again. Why did you come back? Why now, after 15 years? Mavis looked up, her face ravaged by more than just the night's cold. I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. I couldn't die without telling someone what we did, without at least giving you the chance to find him, to bury him properly. We've carried this for 15 years, Grant added. Every day the weight of it. We moved away, changed our names, tried to build a new life, but it never went away. Mavis got sick, and she said she needed to come back, needed to tell the truth before she died. Elna stared at them, these 2 broken people who had broken her in turn. Part of her wanted to pull the trigger, wanted to make them pay for what they'd taken from her. But another part, the part that sounded like Owen's voice in her memory, whispered that revenge wouldn't bring him back, wouldn't heal anything. She lowered the rifle slightly, though she didn't set it down. The hunting shelter. You can take me there. In this weather? Grant looked toward the window where snow was still falling lightly. I've been waiting 15 years for answers. I'm not waiting one more day. Elna stood. We leave in 20 minutes. You're going to show me exactly where you left my brother, and then we're going to find out if there's anything left of him to bury. She pulled out her satellite phone and dialed Sheriff Holloway's number. When he answered, she kept her explanation brief. Ben, it's Elna. You need to come up to the cabin. I've found the people who killed Owen. There was a shocked pause on the other end. Elna, what are you talking about? Just come. Bring backup. And bring whatever equipment you need to recover remains. She hung up before he could ask more questions. Grant and Mavis sat at the table looking small and frightened. Good, Elna thought. They should be frightened. They'd taken everything from her. The least they could do was help her find what was left. Get ready, she told them. We have a climb ahead of us. The night had been endless. After the phone call, Elna had locked Grant and Mavis in Owen's room, wedging a chair under the door handle. She'd sat in the main room with the rifle across her lap, timber at her feet, and let the revelation sink into her bones. They'd known. These 2 strangers had known what happened to Owen for 15 years, while she'd searched and grieved and blamed herself. The rage that filled her was cold and complete, the kind that didn't burn hot but settled in like winter frost, numbing everything it touched. She examined Owen's things with new eyes. The compass he'd always carried, sitting on the shelf where she'd placed it after the search teams had found nothing. His favorite coffee mug, the one with the chipped rim. The photo on the mantel of the two of them at age 12 and 17, grinning at the camera with dirt on their faces after a day of hiking. Around 3 in the morning, she noticed something she'd missed before. Grant's wrist, when he'd lifted his coffee cup earlier. He'd been wearing a watch. A silver watch with a scratched face that looked old, well-worn. She got up and moved to the bedroom door, pressing her ear against it. Inside, Mavis was coughing, that same wet, painful sound. Grant murmured to her, his voice too low to make out words. But in the silence between coughs, Elna heard something else. A ticking, a watch ticking. She remembered Owen's watch, the one their grandfather had given him. Silver with a scratched face from years of wear. Owen never took it off, not ever. When dawn finally broke and the storm began to clear, Elna opened the bedroom door. Grant was sitting on the edge of the bed, Mavis propped against pillows behind him. They both looked exhausted, hollowed out. "That watch you're wearing," Elna said without preamble. "Take it off." Grant looked down at his wrist, then back at her. Something like resignation crossed his face. He unclasped the watch and handed it over without argument. Elna turned it over in her palm. On the back, engraved in careful script, "To Owen for your 18th birthday. May you always find your way home. Love, Grandpa." Her hand closed around it so tightly the metal edges bit into her palm. "He never took this off." "He gave it to me," Grant said quietly, "before we left him. He was conscious by then, talking. He said to take it, that we needed it more than he did. Said we could sell it, get enough money for food. And you took it." The words were bitter on her tongue. "You tied up a man with a head injury and took the watch off his wrist." "I'm not proud of what we did," Grant said. "There's no excuse for it. But Owen, he tried to give us grace even then. He said everyone deserved a second chance." Elna wanted to call him a liar, to say Owen would never forgive the people who left him to die. But the truth was she didn't know. Owen had always been better than her at seeing the good in people. It was entirely possible he'd tried to show kindness, even in those final moments. She slipped the watch into her pocket. "Mavis stays here. You and I are going to that shelter. Mavis needs to stay warm," Grant protested. "She's too weak to travel, but she can't be left alone. She'll have water and blankets. When the sheriff gets here, he'll take care of her." Elna checked her rifle, loaded her pack with emergency supplies. "You, on the other hand, are going to show me exactly where you left my brother. And if you try to run, or if I think you're lying to me about the location, I'll leave you up there and let the mountain do what it does." Grant's face paled, but he nodded. "I understand," Mavis called out weakly as they prepared to leave. "Elna, please, the shelter, it's not what you think." Grant turned sharply. "Mavis, rest. Don't—" "She deserves to know," Mavis insisted, her voice gaining a thread of strength. "There's more. Things we didn't tell you." Elna crossed the room in 3 strides and stood over the bed. "Then tell me now." But Mavis shook her head, already retreating. "Grant will show you. When you get there, it's better if you see for yourself." The cryptic warning set Elna's nerves on edge, but she didn't have time to press. Dawn was breaking, and she wanted to make the trek in full daylight. She gave Mavis a final look. This frail woman who'd helped kill her brother, then turned away. She and Grant set out as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Timber bounded ahead, energized by the fresh air and the prospect of a long walk. Grant struggled from the first step, his breath coming hard as they climbed the initial slope away from the cabin. Elna set a punishing pace, partly because she wanted to reach the shelter quickly, and partly because she wanted Grant to suffer. Let him feel some small fraction of what Owen must have felt, injured and alone, and fighting for his life. They traveled in silence for the first hour. The terrain was difficult, steep in places, with patches of ice hidden under fresh snow. Grant slipped twice, catching himself on trees both times. Elna made no move to help him. As they crested the first ridge, Grant finally spoke. "I know you hate us. You have every right to. I don't want to hear it. I just need you to understand. We weren't bad people. We'd just run out of options. Elna stopped and turned to face him. You had options. You could have asked for help. Owen would have given it. The town had resources, shelters, food banks. But you chose to rob and abandon someone who'd shown you nothing but kindness. Don't talk to me about options. Grant had no response to that. They continued in silence. The second ridge was steeper, more treacherous. Grant's age showed in every labored step. Elna found herself watching him, not out of concern, but out of calculation. If he collapsed up here, could she find the shelter on her own? How specific were his directions? How much further? She asked after another hour of climbing. Another mile, maybe less. Grant pointed to a distant stand of pines. Through those trees. The shelter's in a clearing just beyond. Timber had gone ahead, scouting as he always did on these trails. Suddenly he stopped, ears alert, looking toward something Elna couldn't see. What is it, boy? She moved forward cautiously. Timber whined. A sound she'd learned meant he'd found something significant. She pushed through the pines and emerged into a small clearing. There, half collapsed and reclaimed by the forest, stood the remains of an old hunting shelter. Elna's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. This was where they'd left Owen, where her brother had spent his final hours. Grant came up behind her, breathing hard. That's the place. Elna approached slowly, reverently, as if the ground itself was sacred. In a way it was. This was her brother's grave, even if no body remained. She pulled aside the rotted wood of the collapsed wall and peered inside. Darkness and decay. The smell of earth and mold. She pulled out her flashlight and swept it across the interior. No body. But there were signs someone had been here. Rope fragments tied to a support beam, frayed and old. The remains of a backpack, torn and scattered. And scratches on the wood, deep gouges that spoke of someone trying desperately to free themselves. Owen had been here, had struggled here, had possibly died here. Elna's knees went weak. She braced herself against the shelter wall. He got free, Grant said quietly from behind her. The rope wasn't as strong as we thought. He must have worked himself loose. If he'd gotten free, where had he gone? Why hadn't he made it home? Timber pawed at the back corner of the shelter, whining again. Elna moved to investigate and found a gap in the floorboards. Underneath, protected from the weather, was a small cache of items. Owen's journal, water-damaged but partially intact. Photographs in a plastic bag. And something else. Something that made her blood run cold. Fresh boot prints in the dirt outside the shelter. Recent ones, no more than a few days old. Someone else had been here. Someone else knew about this place. Elna crouched beside the cache, her hands trembling as she reached for Owen's journal. The leather cover was stiff with water damage, the pages warped and stuck together. She opened it carefully, afraid it might crumble in her hands. Most of the early pages were illegible. The ink bled into abstract patterns that meant nothing. But about halfway through, she found entries that were still readable. Owen's handwriting. That careful script their father had taught him, documenting his final days. She read aloud, needing Grant to hear this, needing him to understand what he'd done. November 3rd. Met that couple from the diner again today. Grant and Mavis. They seem like good people fallen on hard times. Gave them some money. Elna would say I'm being too trusting, but I can't help it. Somebody helped us when Dad died. We pay it forward. Her voice caught on that last sentence, but she forced herself to continue. November 5th. Something strange today. A man in town was asking questions about our cabin, about when we're usually there, how often we leave it empty. Felt wrong. Mentioned it to the couple and they got real quiet. Hope I'm just being paranoid like Elna always says. Elna looked up at Grant. He knew. He sensed something was wrong and he was kind to you anyway. Grant's face was ashen. He said nothing. She turned the pages, found entries from after the attack. Owen's handwriting was shakier here, harder to read, but the words were clear enough. November 7th. Head hurts so bad I can barely see straight. They hit me. Grant and Mavis, can't believe it. Took my watch, some money. Tied me up and left me in this shelter. Managed to work the ropes loose after a few hours. Hands are raw and bleeding, but I'm free. Another entry, same day. Tried to find the trail back. Everything looks the same. Getting dark. Head wound is worse than I thought. Keep getting dizzy. Made it back to the shelter. Need to rest before I try again tomorrow. Days passed between entries. Owen documented trying to signal for help, rationing the small amount of food he had in his pack, drinking from streams. His handwriting deteriorated with each entry, the letters becoming larger and more unsteady. November 10th. Heard the helicopters today. Search parties looking for me. Tried to signal but too weak to make it out of the tree cover. They didn't see me. The cruelty of that image, Owen alive, hearing rescue so close but unable to reach it, made Elna's chest ache. November 12th. Food's gone. Still dizzy all the time. Think the head injury is bad. Should have listened to Elna about being careful who you trust. She was right. She was always right. Elna had to stop reading, blinking back tears. Owen's final thoughts had been of her, of their last argument about his tendency to see the best in people. She forced herself to continue. November 14th. Getting weaker. Hard to write. If anyone finds this, tell Elna I don't blame her. She wanted me to be more careful and I didn't listen. Tell her not to blame herself. Tell her some people are worth the risk of trusting, even if I picked wrong this time. Tell her not to stop trusting everyone because of me. The entry ended there, but there was one more, barely legible, dated 2 days later. Someone's been watching. Heard footsteps outside at night. Too weak to call out. Tomorrow I'll try again. Have to make it home. Elna's probably so worried. That was the last entry. The journal ended abruptly, mid-thought. Elna sat back on her heels, clutching the journal to her chest. Owen had survived for at least 9 days after Grant and Mavis had left him. 9 days of suffering and hope and slowly dying alone. And someone had been here. Someone had watched him and not helped. Who else knew about this? She demanded, turning on Grant. Who else was involved? I don't know what you're talking about. But Grant's face had gone pale, and his eyes kept darting to the fresh boot prints Elna had spotted. These prints are recent. Days old, not years. Someone comes here regularly. Someone's been checking this site. Elna stood, looming over Grant. Who was the man in the diner? The one who told you about the cabin. I told you I don't remember his name. It was 15 years ago. Then describe him. Grant's hands shook as he raised them in a placating gesture. 40s, maybe. Dark hair going grey. Well dressed for a local. Expensive jacket. Said he worked for a surveying company. Elna's mind raced. A surveying company? Why would a surveyor care about her family's cabin? She dug deeper into the cache, finding the documents Owen had hidden. Property deeds, survey maps. And there, mineral rights assessments dated just weeks before Owen's disappearance. The land their cabin sat on contained significant copper deposits, potentially worth millions. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Someone had known about the mineral rights. Someone had wanted her family gone so they could claim the land. Grant and Mavis had been tools, convenient, desperate people who could be manipulated into doing the dirty work. This wasn't just a robbery, Elna said slowly. This was attempted murder. Someone set you up to get rid of my family? Grant looked genuinely shocked. No, the man just said there'd be money in the cabin. He didn't say anything about killing anyone. But when Owen caught you, when you left him to die, did you go back and tell this man what happened? Grant's silence was answer enough. You told him, Elna pressed. And he said what? To keep quiet, to run? He probably gave you money to disappear. $5,000, Grant whispered. He gave us $5,000 and told us to leave Montana and never come back. Said if we talked to anyone, we'd go to prison for murder, because he was covering his tracks. He wanted Owen dead, and you'd done the job for him. Elna's rage was ice-cold now, focused and sharp. Who was he, Grant? What was his name? I swear I can't remember. We were drunk most of that year, desperate and scared. He was just some man in a nice coat who offered us money. Elna grabbed the photographs from the cache. Most were family pictures, but one showed Owen with a group of friends at what looked like a town gathering. She held it up to Grant. Is he in this picture? Grant squinted at it, his eyes moving over the faces. Then he froze, his finger trembling as he pointed to a man in the background. That's him. I'm sure of it. The man was partially turned away, but Elna recognized him. Dale Winters. He'd worked at the trading post in Ridgemont for as long as she could remember. Was still there, still living in town, living his life while Owen rotted in these mountains. A sound made them both turn. Timber was growling, looking back the way they'd come. Someone was approaching. Elna grabbed her rifle and moved to a defensive position behind the shelter wall. Through the trees, she saw two figures. Sheriff Holloway, his uniform visible even at a distance, and beside him, walking with the easy confidence of someone who knew these trails, was Dale Winters. Elna's finger moved to the trigger. The man who'd orchestrated Owen's death was walking right toward her, and she had to decide justice through the law or justice through the barrel of her rifle before she could act. Dale saw her and raised his hand in greeting. "Elna, thank God you're all right. Ben told me what happened. I came to help." The audacity of it, pretending concern, pretending innocence, when Owen's journal and the evidence at her feet told a different story. Elna stepped out from behind the shelter, rifle raised, aimed directly at Dale's chest. "Stop right there," she commanded. "Don't come any closer." Sheriff Holloway immediately put his hand on his weapon. "Elna, what are you doing?" "Ask Dale what he was doing 15 years ago when my brother disappeared. Ask him why his name keeps coming up in connection with Owen's death." Dale's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something else. Calculation. "I don't know what that man told you," he said, gesturing toward Grant, "but you've got it wrong. Way wrong." The standoff held for a long moment. 4 people in a clearing, surrounded by indifferent pines and silent snow. Timber positioned himself at Elna's side, hackles raised, sensing the danger in the air. Sheriff Holloway kept his hand on his weapon but didn't draw it. "Elna, I need you to lower that rifle and explain what's happening. You called me about Owen. Now you're pointing a gun at Dale Winters?" "Grant Harrell identified him," Elna said, not lowering the rifle. "He's the man who paid them to rob our cabin. The man who wanted my family gone so he could get to the mineral rights." "That's not true." Dale's voice was calm, measured. "Elna, I understand you're upset. These people walk in and tell you some story about Owen, and you want someone to blame. But I'm not that person. You're in this photograph," Elna said, gesturing with her head toward the picture lying on the ground. "Owen knew you. You were asking questions about our cabin right before he disappeared. Of course I knew Owen. Everyone in Ridgemont knew Owen. He was a good man." Dale took a careful step forward. "And yes, I was doing survey work back then. It was my job to ask questions about property boundaries." "Don't move," Elna warned, finger tightening on the trigger. Sheriff Holloway stepped between them. "Everyone calm down. Dale, stay where you are. Elna, I need you to lower that weapon so we can talk about this rationally." "There's nothing rational about this," Elna snapped. "Owen documented everything in his journal. Someone was watching this shelter. Someone made sure he didn't survive. Then let me see the journal," Holloway said. "Let me look at the evidence." "But I can't do that with guns pointed at people." Elna hesitated. Ben Holloway had always been fair with her, even when she'd pushed him away. He'd led the search for Owen, had never officially closed the case. She wanted to trust him, but trust had cost Owen his life. Finally, she lowered the rifle slightly, not all the way, but enough to show she wasn't planning to shoot immediately. "Grant, show him the journal." Grant, who'd been standing frozen during the entire confrontation, moved slowly to pick up Owen's journal and the documents. He handed them to the sheriff with shaking hands. Holloway read quickly, his expression growing more troubled with each page. When he finished, he looked at Dale with new wariness. "These are serious allegations, Dale. Mineral rights worth millions, a man dying under suspicious circumstances, and your name coming up in the investigation. Ben, you know me. I've lived in Ridgemont my whole life. You really think I'm capable of murder?" Dale's voice carried wounded innocence. But Elna heard something underneath it, the careful control of someone used to lying. "I don't know what I think anymore," Holloway turned to Grant. "You're saying Dale Winters paid you to rob the Dreer cabin?" "Someone did," Grant said. "A man fitting his description." But what?" Elna demanded. Grant looked between Dale and the sheriff, clearly struggling with something. "I'm not certain it was him. 15 years is a long time. I was drunk and desperate. Maybe I'm misremembering. Convenient, Elna said bitterly. Or honest, Dale interjected. Look, I admit I knew about the mineral deposits. That was public record once the survey was done. Yes, I worked for Gaines Surveying back then. Trevor Gaines was my boss. And yes, he was interested in this land. But I had nothing to do with what happened to Owen. Elna's attention sharpened. Trevor Gaines, that's who you worked for? Until I quit 6 months before Owen disappeared. I didn't like how Gaines operated, how he pressured landowners, how he tried to manipulate property deals. Dale's voice gained intensity. When Owen vanished, I suspected Gaines might be involved, but I couldn't prove anything. The man's connected, wealthy. He'd have buried me if I'd made accusations without evidence. Sheriff Holloway was taking notes now, his earlier defensive posture toward Dale softening. Where's Trevor Gaines now? Nevada, last I heard. Made his fortune in mining after he left Montana. But Dale paused, his expression troubled. He's back. Bought property near Ridgemont about 6 months ago. Big spread. Planning some kind of development 6 months ago. Around the time the fresh boot prints would have started appearing at the shelter. Elna's mind raced through the implications. He's been checking this site, she said. Making sure Owen's body stayed hidden. Making sure there was no evidence connecting him to the death. That's speculation, Holloway cautioned, is it? Elna pulled out the survey documents. Owen found out about the mineral rights. He documented his discovery. Someone wanted him dead before he could do anything with that information. Gaines had motive and opportunity. Dale nodded slowly. There's more. After Owen disappeared, I started asking questions around town, quietly. A few people mentioned seeing Gaines in the area that week. One of the search and rescue volunteers said he'd spotted Gaines's truck on the old forest road the night Owen went missing. Why didn't you come forward with this 15 years ago? Elna's voice was sharp with accusation. Because I had no proof, just suspicions and hearsay. And I knew if I accused a man like Gaines without solid evidence, I'd be the one who ended up destroyed. Dale met her eyes directly. I failed your brother. I admit that. I should have been braver. But I wasn't lying to you just now. I didn't hire these people. Gaines did. Elna wanted to believe him. Wanted there to be someone in this story who tried, however inadequately, to do the right thing. But 15 years of isolation had taught her caution. Prove it, she said. If Gaines is behind this, prove it. I might be able to, Dale said. I kept records from my time working for him. Documents he thought I'd destroyed. Including some correspondence about this property, about wanting the Dreer family off the land. Why keep them? Holloway asked. Insurance. Gaines was the type to throw his employees under the bus if things went wrong. I wanted leverage if he ever came after me. Sheriff Holloway looked at Elna. This changes things. If Dale's telling the truth, we're looking at a much bigger conspiracy than a simple robbery gone wrong. Elna lowered her rifle completely, though she kept it in her hands. We need to go back to the cabin now. Mavis is there alone. A look of alarm crossed Dale's face. If Gaines knows Grant and Mavis came back, if he thinks they're talking, he didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood. Gaines would want to eliminate any witnesses to his crime. And Mavis, sick and weak, was vulnerable. They moved as a group back toward the cabin, no longer adversaries, but an uneasy alliance. Elna led the way, her knowledge of the trails making her the fastest. Her mind kept returning to Owen's journal, to that last entry about someone watching the shelter. How long had Gaines monitored Owen's dying? Had he been there close enough to help, choosing instead to let nature finish what Grant and Mavis had started? The thought made her sick with rage. As they descended the final slope, Timber suddenly bolted ahead, barking frantically. Elna's blood went cold. She broke into a run, rifle ready, fear clawing at her chest. The cabin came into view. Smoke was rising from the chimney, normal. But there was another vehicle parked beside Holloway's cruiser, an expensive truck with Nevada plates. Gaines was already here. Elna approached the cabin with her rifle raised, moving from tree to tree, using cover the way her father had taught her. Behind her, Sheriff Holloway had drawn his weapon, and even Dale had picked up a fallen branch, inadequate as it was. Grant brought up the rear, looking terrified. Through the window, Elna could see movement. 2 figures, maybe 3. She circled to get a better angle and felt her heart hammer against her ribs. Trevor Gaines stood in her cabin's main room, tall and imposing, in an expensive wool coat. He was talking to someone she couldn't see, his posture aggressive. Then she saw Mavis, still in the chair where they'd left her, looking even more fragile than before. And standing beside Gaines was another man, younger, built like someone who made his living with violence. Sheriff Holloway came up beside Elna, assessed the situation. "That's Gaines?" "Has to be," Dale confirmed quietly. "That's his truck. We need to get Mavis out of there," Elna said. "We need to call for backup," Holloway countered, pulling out his radio. But before he could transmit, the cabin door opened and Gaines stepped out onto the porch. He wasn't alone. The younger man followed, and now Elna could see the gun in his hand. They had Mavis between them, supporting her weak frame. "Elna Dreer," Gaines called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "I know you're out there. You and the sheriff and whoever else you've collected. Why don't we talk about this like reasonable people?" "Let the woman go," Holloway shouted back. "She needs medical attention. She needs to keep her mouth shut," Gaines replied. "But seeing as she's dying anyway, I suppose it doesn't matter much. Come out, Elna. You want answers about your brother? I'll give them to you. It was a trap. Obviously, a trap. But it was also an opportunity." Elna moved before Holloway could stop her, stepping out from behind the trees with her rifle trained on Gaines. "I'm here. Now let her go and tell me what you did to Owen." Gaines smiled, the expression cold and calculated. "I didn't do anything to Owen. Your brother was collateral damage in a business transaction. Nothing personal. You had him killed. I facilitated an opportunity for 2 desperate people to make bad choices. What they did after that isn't my responsibility." Gaines's smile widened. "Though I'll admit I was pleased with how it worked out. The Dreer family off the land, the mineral rights available for acquisition. Would have been perfect if you died too." The casual admission stunned Elna. He was confessing to murder, conspiracy, everything, because he didn't plan on any of them leaving this mountain alive. "You're insane," she said. "The sheriff's right here. You can't kill all of us, can't I? You're on your own property, miles from town. Tragic accident. Gas leak from your stove, maybe. Fire consumes the cabin and everyone in it." Gaines shrugged. "These things happen in remote locations." The younger man moved slightly, adjusting his grip on Mavis. Elna tracked him with her rifle. But she couldn't get a clear shot without risking Mavis. "You won't get away with this," Holloway said, moving to flank Gaines from another position. "I've already called for backup. They'll be here within the hour. Then we'd better work quickly." Gaines nodded to his associate, who produced a knife and held it to Mavis's throat. "Everyone puts their weapons down, now, or she dies first." Elna's mind raced through options. She was a good shot, but not good enough to guarantee hitting Gaines's man before he could cut Mavis. And despite everything, despite Mavis's role in Owen's death, Elna couldn't let her be murdered in front of her. She began to lower her rifle. But Dale stepped forward, hands raised, voice urgent. "Wait, everyone wait. Gaines, you're making a mistake. There's something you don't know." "What could I possibly need to know from you, Dale?" "You're a coward who couldn't even stand up to me 15 years ago. "I found Owen," Dale said. "After Grant and Mavis left him? I went to the shelter. I was the one watching. I was the one whose footsteps he heard." The clearing went silent. Even Gaines looked surprised. Elna felt her world tilt sideways again. "Not Gaines watching Owen die? Dale? What are you talking about?" she demanded. Dale turned to face her, and for the first time she saw genuine anguish in his expression. "After you called in the search party, I started asking around. Someone mentioned seeing Grant and Mavis headed toward the mountains. I put it together. They'd done something to Owen. I went looking. Found the shelter. Found him. And you didn't help him?" Elna's voice was raw with betrayal. "I tried. God, I tried. But he was hurt worse than I realized. Head injury, maybe bleeding internally. He was delirious. Thought I was there to finish him off. Wouldn't let me near him. Fought me when I tried to carry him out." Dale's voice broke. "I left to get medical supplies, to bring help. When I came back the next morning, he was gone. I searched for hours. Found signs he'd tried to walk out, but he must have collapsed somewhere. "I'd never found him. You should have told someone," Holloway said. I know, but by then days had passed, and I had no proof of anything, except that I'd been at the scene where Owen died. Gaines would have pinned the whole thing on me." Dale looked at Elna with desperate sincerity. "I've been searching for his body for 15 years. Coming back to the shelter, checking the area. I wanted to give you closure, to let you bury him. I just never found him." Elna didn't know what to believe anymore. Every truth she'd thought she understood kept shifting. Gaines laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "What a touching confession. Doesn't change anything, though. You're all still witnesses to what I just admitted. You all still have to disappear." But Dale wasn't finished. "Except I recorded everything. That confession you just made. It's been going straight to my phone, which is uploading to the cloud." "You're done, Gaines." The younger man moved his knife from Mavis's throat, reaching for Dale instead. In that moment of distraction, 3 things happened simultaneously. Timber launched himself at the man holding Mavis, 60 pounds of protective fury going for the arm with the knife. Elna fired, her shot deliberately high, but close enough to make Gaines's associate flinch and drop his weapon. And Sheriff Holloway charged forward, tackling Gaines to the ground. Chaos erupted. Mavis collapsed, freed from the man's grip. Grant ran to her side. The younger man struggled with Timber, trying to fend off snapping jaws. Elder advanced, rifle trained on Gaines, who was now pinned beneath Holloway's weight. "Don't move," she commanded. "Everyone freeze." Slowly the scene stabilized. Holloway had Gaines in handcuffs. Dale had retrieved the dropped knife and was keeping the other man at bay until Holloway could secure him too. Timber stood guard over Mavis, still growling but no longer attacking. Elna kept her rifle ready, not trusting any of it to be over. "Not yet. Check Dale's recording," she said to Holloway. "If he's telling the truth about that, then Gaines just confessed to everything." Dale pulled out his phone with shaking hands, played back the audio. Clear as day, Gaines's voice admitting to orchestrating Owen's death, to planning to kill them all. "That'll hold up in court," Holloway confirmed. "Trevor Gaines, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and about 10 other charges I'll think of on the way to the station." Gaines said nothing, but his expression was venomous. He'd been undone by his own arrogance, his assumption that remote location equaled safety. As Holloway loaded both men into his cruiser, backup finally arrived. 2 more sheriff's vehicles and an ambulance. Paramedics immediately went to Mavis, starting IVs, checking her vitals. She'd make it long enough to testify, which was all that mattered for justice. Elna stood on her porch, watching it all unfold, Owen's watch heavy in her pocket and his journal clutched in her hand. She had answers now. Not all of them good, not all of them what she'd hoped for, but answers nonetheless. Dale approached carefully, keeping his distance. "I know you have no reason to believe me about trying to save Owen, but it's the truth. I failed him, and I've carried that for 15 years. Elna looked at him, this man who might have saved her brother or might have watched him die. She didn't know which version to believe. "Maybe she never would. The search continues," she said finally. "Owen's body is out there somewhere. We're going to find him." Dale nodded. "I'll help, for whatever that's worth." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever. But it was a start towards something that might eventually resemble peace. The next hours passed in a blur of official procedure. Sheriff Holloway took statements from everyone. Elna, Grant, Mavis, from her stretcher in the ambulance, even Dale. The paramedics tried to convince Elna to get checked out too, but she refused. Her ribs might be bruised from the confrontation, her exhaustion bone deep. But she needed to see this through. Grant and Mavis were arrested. Read their rights, given the same speech about cooperation and reduced sentences. Grant agreed to everything without protest, sitting in the back of one cruiser with his head in his hands. Mavis, strapped to a gurney with IV lines running into her arms, gave her statement in a whisper, crying through most of it. "I'll make sure the prosecutor knows they cooperated," Holloway told Elna, "and that they came back voluntarily to confess." "That'll count for something." Elna nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The rage she'd felt toward Grant and Mavis had transformed into something more complicated. Not forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. They'd made terrible choices born of desperation. Owen had died because of those choices. Both things were true, and she'd have to find a way to live with that. As the last cruiser pulled away with Gaines and his associate secured inside, silence fell over the clearing. Just Elna, Dale, and Timber remained. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like the end of something. What happens now? Dale asked. We search properly, Elna said. With everything we know now, with the journal entries about which direction he was heading, we can narrow down the search area. We're going to find him. Tonight? Tomorrow? At first light. She was already planning it in her head, mapping out quadrants, calculating how much ground they could cover. I'll need help. People who know these mountains, who can handle the terrain. I'll organize it, Dale offered. There are still folks in town who remember Owen, who'd want to help. Elna hesitated, then nodded. She needed the help, and Dale, whatever his failures 15 years ago, seemed genuinely committed to making amends. That night, Elna sat alone in her cabin with Owen's journal. She read every legible entry multiple times, searching for clues about where he might have gone after leaving the shelter. He'd mentioned trying to find the trail. In his delirium, he'd thought he was heading east toward home. But east from the shelter led into rougher country, an area of ravines and fallen timber where an injured, confused man could easily get lost. She spread out her maps, marking the shelter's location and drawing circles representing how far Owen could have traveled in his weakened state. Not far, maybe 2 or 3 miles at most before he'd collapsed for the final time. That was still a significant search area, but it was manageable with enough people. Timber lay at her feet, occasionally lifting his head to check on her. The dog had been through a lot today, too. Combat, strangers, chaos in his peaceful domain. She reached down to scratch his ears, drawing comfort from his solid presence. We're going to find him, boy, she murmured. Tomorrow we bring him home. The watch sat on the table before her, its steady ticking a reminder that time moved forward whether you wanted it to or not. 15 years since Owen had worn this watch. 15 years since she'd heard his voice or seen his smile. Finding his remains wouldn't bring him back, but it would give her something to bury, somewhere to visit, a marker that proved he'd existed. Morning came cold and clear. Elna was awake before dawn, as always, preparing for what might be the most important search of her life. She packed supplies methodically. Rope, first aid kit, emergency blankets, a body bag that Sheriff Holloway had provided with solemn practicality. The search party began arriving around 8. Dale had organized it well, 12 people in total, all experienced hikers who knew the Bitterroot range. Some were volunteer search and rescue members. Others were simply town residents who'd known Owen and wanted closure too. Sheriff Holloway was there, along with 2 deputies. He'd brought ground-penetrating radar equipment and cadaver dogs, modern tools that hadn't been available 15 years ago. We're treating this as a recovery operation, Holloway explained to the assembled group. Based on the journal entries and witness statements, we believe Elna Dreer's remains are located somewhere in a 2-mile radius east of the old hunting shelter. We're going to grid search the area, working in teams of 3. If anyone finds anything, clothing, remains, personal effects, you mark the location and radio immediately. We preserve the scene and let the professionals handle it from there. Elna listened to the instructions with half an ear. She knew these protocols. What she cared about was getting started, getting out there, bringing Owen home. They hiked to the shelter first, the whole group together. Several of the volunteers laid flowers at the entrance, a gesture that touched Elna more than she'd expected. Owen had been loved. Despite his death, despite the years, people remembered him kindly. From the shelter they spread out into their assigned search grids. Elna insisted on taking the eastern quadrant, the direction Owen had been heading. Dale volunteered to partner with her, and she accepted. Whatever her doubts about him, he knew these mountains, and he'd been searching this area for years. The terrain was brutal. Steep slopes covered in deadfall. Hidden ravines, where snow had drifted deep, dense thickets of pine that blocked out the sun. Exactly the kind of place where an injured, disoriented man could stumble and not be found for years. They searched in silence for the first hour, methodically working their grid pattern. The dogs ranged ahead, sniffing at fallen logs and brush piles. Every few minutes, someone's radio would crackle with an update, negative findings mostly, occasional false alarms that turned out to be animal remains. Around noon, one of the dogs alerted. Not in Elna's quadrant, but close enough that she heard the handler's excited call on the radio. Possible contact, Grid 7. Requesting support, Elna ran, Dale struggling to keep up. Grid 7 was a ravine about a mile from the shelter, a steep-sided cut in the earth where a seasonal stream had eroded the rock. She arrived to find the dog handler peering down into the ravine, the cadaver dog sitting at attention beside him. "Something's down there," the handler said. "Dog's positive, but it's a tough climb." Sheriff Holloway arrived with rope and climbing gear. "I'll go down with a deputy. Everyone else stays up here." "No," Elna said firmly. "If that's Owen, I'm going down." Holloway looked like he wanted to argue, then nodded. "All right. But you follow my lead, and you don't touch anything until I clear you too." They rigged a rope system and descended carefully. The ravine was deeper than it looked from above, maybe 30 feet to the bottom. Snow and ice made the footing treacherous. Elna focused on each handhold, each step, forcing herself to be careful when every instinct screamed at her to hurry. At the bottom, the world was dim and cold. The ravine walls blocked most of the light. Holloway pulled out a powerful flashlight and swept it across the area. Immediately he stopped, "Over there," he said quietly. Elna followed the light and saw what he was pointing at. Partially buried under deadfall and years of accumulated debris, a scatter of bones. And beside them, the rotted remains of a backpack with a familiar pattern, the one Owen had been wearing when he disappeared. Her knees went weak. She'd been searching for 15 years, and here he was, or what was left of him. The finality of it was overwhelming. Holloway put a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. After a moment, she moved closer, kneeling beside the remains. The forensics team would need to confirm identity, but she knew. This was Owen, her brother, who'd been kind to strangers, who'd trusted too easily, who died alone in this cold, dark place. "I'm sorry," she whispered. To Owen, to herself, to the years of grief and searching. "I'm so sorry it took me this long to find you." Over the next hours, the professionals took over. Photographs, measurements, careful collection of every bone and artifact. Elna watched from above, sitting on the ravine edge with timber pressed against her side. Dale sat with her in companionable silence, occasionally offering water or a granola bar she didn't eat. When they finally brought Owen's remains up, sealed in proper bags for transport, Elna stood and saluted, an old habit from her park ranger days. But it felt right. Owen had served no military time, but he'd been a soldier of kindness in his way, and he deserved that recognition. "He's going home now," Sheriff Holloway said gently. "We'll do the official identification, but we can release him for burial within a week or so. You can start making arrangements, burial arrangements, a funeral, a headstone, all the rituals of death she'd been unable to perform for 15 years. The thought was simultaneously heartbreaking and healing. As the sun set on their second long day, Elna stood at the ravine edge and said a private goodbye to the place where Owen had died. Tomorrow she'd start planning his funeral. Tomorrow she'd begin the process of truly mourning and then, eventually, moving forward. But tonight she allowed herself to simply feel all the grief, all the loss, all the relief of finally knowing. The search was over. Her brother was found. And while that couldn't undo the past, it opened a door to a future where she might someday find peace. The week following Owen's recovery passed in a strange blur of activity and emotion. The forensics report came back quickly, confirming what Elna already knew. The remains were Owen's. Dental records matched. DNA testing was ordered as well, but the preliminary identification was enough for Elna to begin making arrangements. She chose a plot in the small cemetery outside Ridgemont, under an oak tree with a view of the mountains. Owen would have liked that, she thought. Close enough to town to have visitors, but with the wilderness visible in the distance. Sheriff Holloway helped with the paperwork, navigating the bureaucracy that came with burying someone who'd been missing for 15 years. The funeral home treated her with careful kindness, understanding that this grief was both fresh and ancient. She selected a simple casket, appropriate for the small amount of remains they'd recovered. She wrote an obituary that tried to capture who Owen had been, kind, trusting, beloved brother and friend. She arranged for a service at the community church, though she hadn't set foot in it since before he disappeared. Word spread quickly through Ridgemont. The story of Owen's death and the conspiracy behind it made local and state news. Reporters called constantly, wanting interviews, comments, details. Elna ignored them all. This wasn't a story for public consumption. It was her brother's death, her family's tragedy, and she'd share it on her own terms or not at all. Grant and Mavis were being held pending trial, though Mavis's deteriorating condition meant she'd likely die before ever seeing a courtroom. The prosecutor offered deals in exchange for testimony against Gaines, reduced charges, possible house arrest given Mavis's condition. Grant accepted immediately, eager to cooperate, to somehow make amends for what he'd done. Trevor Gaines, meanwhile, sat in county jail without bail. His lawyers were the expensive kind, the ones who wore $1,000 suits and spoke in carefully crafted statements about presumption of innocence. But Dale's recording was damning, and the evidence from the shelter tied Gaines directly to Owen's death. The case against him was strong. Dale himself had become an unexpected presence in Elna's life. He visited the cabin several times, always respectful, always asking permission. He brought the documents he'd promised. Correspondence between Gaines and mining companies, survey reports marked confidential, evidence of the conspiracy to acquire the Dreer land. Holloway collected it all for the prosecution. "I should have done this 15 years ago," Dale said during one visit, sitting at Elna's table with coffee neither of them was drinking. "Should have stood up to Gaines, should have gone to the police with what I suspected." "Yes," Elna agreed. "You should have." Dale flinched but didn't argue. "I know I can't make up for that failure, but I'm going to try. By testifying?" "By testifying, yes. And by establishing a fund, Owen's name, for search and rescue operations in these mountains. So maybe his death can prevent other families from going through what you did. It was a grand gesture, possibly meaningless, but it was something. More than Grant and Mavis had offered until guilt and impending death had forced their hands. Pauline Travers, Elna's old friend, came to the cabin bearing casseroles and sympathy. She'd aged since they'd last spoken regularly, grey showing in her dark hair, lines around her eyes. But her embrace was warm, and for the first time in years, Elna allowed herself to accept comfort from another human being. "I'm so sorry," Pauline said. "About Owen, about everything. I pushed you away," Elna replied. "After he disappeared, I pushed everyone away. You were grieving. We all understood that. Did you?" Elna wasn't sure she'd understood it herself until recently. "Or did you just give up trying to reach me?" Pauline didn't answer immediately, considering the question with the honesty of long friendship. "Maybe both. Maybe we could have tried harder, but also maybe you weren't ready to be reached." It was probably true. Elna had built walls so high and thick that even the most determined friend couldn't have scaled them. She'd needed her isolation, her punishment, her vigil. Until yesterday, when Owen's bones had come up from the ravine, she couldn't have imagined life any other way. Now sitting in her cabin with an old friend, planning a funeral instead of another day's solitary patrol, she glimpsed the possibility of something different. Not happiness, that felt impossibly far away, but perhaps companionship, perhaps community, perhaps a life that wasn't entirely defined by loss. "Will you come to the funeral?" Elna asked. "Of course. The whole town will come." Owen was loved. That phrase again. Owen was loved. Past tense, but true. He'd been loved in life, and that love persisted after death. It didn't undo his murder, didn't ease the injustice of his dying alone and afraid. But it meant something. It had to mean something. The night before the funeral, Elna sat on her porch with Timber and watched the stars emerge. Owen had taught her the constellations when they were children. Orion, Cassiopeia, the Big Dipper. He'd loved the stars, loved imagining the distances they represented. The ancient light finally reaching Earth after traveling for millennia. I found you, she said to the stars, to Owen, to the universe. I'm bringing you home now. You can rest. And maybe, eventually, so could she. The morning of the funeral dawned clear and cold, the kind of Montana winter day that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Elna dressed carefully in the one formal outfit she owned, dark pants and a navy sweater that had belonged to her mother. She pinned Owen's compass to her collar, a small memorial he could carry with him one last time. The church was full when she arrived. Elna stood at the entrance for a moment, overwhelmed by the number of people who'd come. Friends from Owen's school days, now graying and middle-aged. Former co-workers from the jobs he'd held before his death. Neighbors from town who'd participated in the original search parties. Even strangers who'd only known Owen through the recent news stories, but felt compelled to pay respects. Sheriff Holloway greeted her at the door, dressed in his formal uniform. Quite a turnout. Your brother touched a lot of lives. He did, Elna managed. I'd forgotten that somehow. In my isolation, I'd reduced him to just mine. But he belonged to all these people too. She walked down the aisle to the closed casket at the front, aware of every eye on her. Dale sat near the back, keeping a respectful distance. Pauline had saved a seat in the front row, and Elna took it gratefully. The service was simple. A local pastor who'd known Owen spoke about kindness and faith, about lives cut short but not wasted. Several people stood to share memories. Owen helping someone fix a flat tire, Owen volunteering at the food bank. Owen always having a smile and a friendly word. Elna listened to these stories of her brother, learning things she'd never known. A woman spoke about how Owen had helped her son with homework, patiently explaining math concepts until the boy understood. A man remembered Owen defending a kid being bullied in high school, standing up even though it meant getting in a fight himself. He saw people, the man said. Really saw them. Made you feel like you mattered. That was Owen exactly. He'd seen Grant and Mavis struggling at the diner and bought them breakfast. He'd seen their humanity, even if they hadn't been able to see his in return. When it was time for family to speak, Elna stood on shaking legs and approached the podium. She'd written nothing, hadn't planned what to say. She simply spoke from the heart. My brother believed in the goodness of people. Even when that belief cost him his life, he held on to it. In his last journal entry, he told me not to stop trusting everyone just because he'd trusted the wrong people. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. That's harder than he made it sound. For 15 years, I trusted no one. I locked myself away from the world, from friendship, from anything that might hurt me the way losing him hurt. She looked out at the gathered faces, at the community that had tried to support her and been pushed away. But I'm done with that now. Owen wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life alone on that mountain, afraid to let anyone in. He'd want me to live, to connect, to keep believing that most people are good, even if some aren't. She touched the compass at her collar. So I'm going to try. I'm going to honor his memory by being braver than I've been, by being more like him. She sat down to respectful silence, Pauline squeezing her hand. The service continued with hymns and prayers, the familiar rituals of grief and goodbye. When it ended, the pallbearers, Sheriff Holloway, Dale, and 4 men who'd been Owen's friends, carried the casket out to the waiting hearse. The burial at the cemetery was brief. Cold wind whipped across the open ground as the pastor said final words. Elna placed a handful of mountain soil on the casket before it was lowered. Dirt from the cabin's land, mixing with the earth of Owen's final resting place. As people began to disperse, heading to the reception at the community hall, Elna stayed behind. She needed a moment alone with Owen, here at his grave, where she'd be able to visit, where he'd finally have a marker to prove he'd existed and been loved. Dale approached carefully. I'll give you space, but I wanted you to know the fund is set up. The Elna Dreer Search and Rescue Fund. First donation already came in. Someone found the website and contributed $5,000 anonymously. Elna nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Owen's death would save other lives. It was small comfort, but it was something. Thank you, she managed finally, for everything. For trying to save him, for finding the evidence, for being here. It's the least I could do. Dale hesitated, then asked, "Will you be okay?" Up there alone on the mountain, Elna looked at the grave, then at the mountains visible beyond the cemetery's edge. Her home, Owen's home, the place that had taken him and hidden him for 15 years before finally giving him back. "I'll be okay," she said. "I'm not alone anymore. I'm just starting to understand that." And strange as it seemed, it was true. Standing at her brother's grave, surrounded by a community that had never stopped caring, Elna felt less alone than she had in 15 years. The healing had begun 3 months after the funeral. Spring began its slow arrival in the Bitterroot range. Snow melted on the southern slopes, revealing patches of brown earth and the first brave shoots of green. The mountain was waking up, and so was Elna Dreer. She still woke before dawn, still made her morning patrol with Timber at her side. Some habits were too deeply ingrained to break, and she didn't want to break them anyway. The mountain was still her home, the cabin still her sanctuary. But now they were something more than just a memorial to loss. They were a place to live, not just exist. The trial of Trevor Gaines was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. Grant and Mavis would testify, their cooperation earning them reduced sentences as promised. Grant would serve 5 years. Mavis had died in March, her cancer finally claiming her. She'd left a letter for Elna, delivered by her lawyer after her death. Elna had read it once and then put it away. Some forgiveness took time, and she wasn't there yet. The letter had said simply, "I'm sorry. Not because I'm dying and afraid of judgment, but because what we did was unforgivable. Owen deserved better. You deserved better. I hope you find peace." Peace. That had seemed impossible 3 months ago. Now Elna could glimpse its outline on the horizon, like mountains visible through morning mist. Not reached yet, but reachable. Dale had become a regular visitor to the cabin. He came once a week, sometimes bringing supplies, sometimes just company. They'd developed an easy friendship built on shared grief and the slow work of making amends. He'd shown her the Elna Dreer Search and Rescue Fund's website, which had raised over $50,000. Enough to purchase equipment, train volunteers, maybe save a life or two. He'd be proud of this, Dale said, during one visit, showing her photos of the new rescue gear being distributed. His death meaning something, his life meant something, Elna corrected gently. The death was just the end of it. She'd been thinking a lot about legacy, about what remained when someone was gone. Owen's kindness had rippled outward in ways he'd never know. The people he'd helped, the smiles he'd given, the generosity he'd modeled, those things persisted. They'd shaped the world in small but real ways. Sheriff Holloway stopped by less frequently, but always with updates about the case. Gaines's lawyers were trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor was holding firm. With Dale's recording, the journal, the testimony from Grant, and the physical evidence from the shelter, the case was nearly airtight. Gaines would spend the rest of his life in prison. Justice for Owen, Holloway said during his last visit. Finally, yes, Elna agreed, though she'd learned that justice and peace weren't quite the same thing. Gaines in prison wouldn't bring Owen back, wouldn't erase 15 years of searching. But it mattered. It had to matter. Pauline had become a regular presence too, sometimes bringing her husband, sometimes coming alone for long talks over coffee. They were rebuilding their friendship slowly, carefully, like people relearning a language they'd once been fluent in. "You seem different," Pauline observed one afternoon in early April, sitting on the porch as the sun warmed the wood beneath them. "Lighter somehow. I feel different," Elna admitted. "Like I've been holding my breath for 15 years and finally exhaled. What are you going to do now? Stay up here?" It was a question Elna had been asking herself. The cabin was paid for, the land was hers, and she had no real reason to leave. But staying out of necessity was different from staying by choice. "I think so," she said finally. "But differently. Not hiding anymore. Maybe I'll get involved with the Search and Rescue Fund, train new volunteers. Maybe I'll take on some part-time ranger work again. I don't know yet. You've got time to figure it out. Time, that was something she had now. Not borrowed time, not time spent searching and grieving. Just time, stretching ahead, full of possibility. That evening, Elna walked to the ridge where Owen's childhood cairn stood. She'd added stones to it over the months, building it higher, making it a proper memorial. Other people had added stones too, visitors who'd heard the story and wanted to contribute. It was becoming a landmark, a place of remembrance. She placed another stone carefully, balancing it atop the others. Owen's watch was in her pocket, ticking steadily. She'd had it repaired and now wore it sometimes, feeling the familiar weight on her wrist. Timber sat beside her, greying muzzle lifted to scent the wind. He was getting older, would need to be replaced someday. But that was future worry. Right now he was here solid and faithful. I kept my promise, Elna said to the cairn, to Owen, to the mountain. I found you, brought you home, and I'm learning to live again, the way you would have wanted. The wind carried her words away, up toward the peaks where eagles soared and snow never fully melted. Somewhere in those mountains, Owen's spirit rested. Not trapped, not suffering, just there, part of the landscape he'd loved. Elna turned to head back to the cabin as the sun began to set. Behind her, the cairn stood as witness. Ahead of her, smoke rose from her chimney, promising warmth and dinner and another evening of life continuing. She wasn't alone on the mountain anymore. Dale would visit tomorrow, Pauline later in the week. The community that had tried to help her for 15 years had finally broken through her walls. Not because they'd pushed harder, but because she'd finally opened the door. It wasn't the ending she would have chosen. Owen should have lived, should have grown old, should have had the chance to see his kindness reflected in the fund that bore his name. But he hadn't gotten that chance, and Elna had to live with that reality. What she could control was what came next. How she honored his memory, how she carried his lessons forward, how she chose to live in the wake of his death. As she walked back to the cabin with timber at her heels and the first stars emerging overhead, Elna Dreer made a choice. She would live fully, love carefully but not fearfully, and trust that some people, most people, were worth the risk. It's what Owen would have wanted. And for the first time in 15 years, that was reason enough.